Kia ora, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Good evening, welcome to tonight's Fabian session. I'm Philip Tremura and I'm chairing the session tonight. And I'll be introducing our two experts on the actions New Zealand is taking in dealing with climate change. Now, in a month's time, as you know, our Climate Change Minister James Shaw is heading off to Glasgow to COP26, the crucial conference. Interestingly enough, we're sending just the one journalist that I'm aware of. Rod Oram is going, so he'll be sending podcasts back, and you'll be able to hear those on Newsroom. But what is New Zealand going to take to this conference? What are we taking to the international table, both in terms of actions already taken and forthcoming actions in the future? Catherine and James are both members of the New Zealand Climate Commission, but they'll each begin their respective talks with their own professional hats on. I should have brought a Climate Commission hat for them to put on so you knew which hat they were wearing at the time. But they'll begin, James will outline the rapid escalation of climate impacts, and Catherine's going to speak to the role of the emissions trading scheme and its relationship to other policies. They'll then each move to the role of the Climate Commission and the recommendations before government. There'll be time for questions at the end of each speaker, so rather than wait till the end of the whole thing, we'll take a break after each speaker, and we'll be taking questions both from our live audience here and also from our online audience. So if people are zooming in, please write your questions in the chat section and Andre will pick them up from there. So introducing first James Renwick, climate researcher who studies Southern Hemisphere climate variability and the impacts of climate change on the Pacific, on New Zealand and the Antarctic. He's been a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, for many years, including the 6th assessment report published this year. He was appointed to the Climate Commission in 2019. He's head of school, the School of Geography, Environment and Earth Sciences at Victoria. So James, can you start us in with the latest assessment report?
Thank you, Philip. And yes, I can. Kia ora koutou. Thanks for coming along. So, as Philip said, I'm speaking roughly for the first half of my talk on what the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has to say, and the second half of the talk on the advice from the Climate Change Commission. And I don't have a hat to wear, depending on which person I'm being, but the slide template for the first few slides is the IPCC one, and then I move into the Climate Change Commission template, so you'll be able to tell the difference, I think. So anyway, just to begin, so this is Working Group 1 that I've been involved in. This is the science of climate change. Working Group 2 on the impacts and adaptation to climate change. That report comes out in, I think, March of next year. And Working Group 3, the mitigation, what we do to reduce emissions, comes out shortly after the Working Group 2 report next year. But I think the Working Group 1 report often is the one that gets the most press. I don't know that necessarily should, but usually all the information about where temperatures are at, how much carbon dioxide we've got left to emit and all that kind of thing does make the press. So I'll start just with a few, literally a few headlines that came out of the report. And I'll just make sure my time is going here. So, first of all, I think one of the features of this new report is the presence of words like unprecedented. There's a lot less likelies and even virtually certains that the sort of probabilistic framing, well, we're not absolutely sure about this or this or this, still there when you look at the actual report, but the summary focused a lot more on the very definite statements. So we know that changes in the climate that are happening at the moment are essentially unprecedented for at least thousands of years, and probably more like tens of thousands of years. So we have quite good reconstructions of global average temperature going back through what's known as the Common Era, the last 2,000 years. That's what you see on the left there. So this is a time series from year one, and the vertical scale is temperature relative to the late, the late 19th century, 1850 to 1900. That's right. So you can see this uncertainty obviously in the reconstructions from ice cores and tree rings and so on. But the solid line you can see goes through, and there's cooling going through the last 1,000 years or so, and then as greenhouse gas emissions really kicked in, we see the rise in temperature in the last couple of 100 years. And the little vertical scale over here, the shading, shows the estimate of the warmest multi-century period in the last 10,000 years. And as of recently, we're now exceeding that. So chances are that it's warmer now than it has been for a long time. On the right there, you can see the record since 1850, which is the instrumental period. The black line is the observations, and then the two shaded regions are climate model simulations. So when you tell climate models about what the sun's doing, what volcanoes are up to, when they're erupting, and how much greenhouse gas there is in the air, you get the red line and that sort of beige shading following the observations pretty well. If you don't tell the models about the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations, you get the green line and the green shading. So the idea there is we can say with some certainty that if we hadn't had the rise in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and especially in the last 70 or so years, we would not have seen the warming that we have seen. So it's pretty incontrovertible that that's the cause of the change we're seeing in the climate. And we know for sure from the chemistry of the atmosphere that this comes largely from burning fossil fuels, i.e. from us. And just a few more detailed statements from the summary for policymakers from the report. So we know it's, like I was saying, this word unequivocal that human activity has warmed the atmosphere, warmed the climate. Global surface temperatures have increased faster since 1970 than in any other 50-year period in the last 2,000 years. And each of the last 4 decades warmer than anything since 1850, and so on. So we know for sure that we're causing the problem, and we're now in a state that hasn't been seen for a long time. And the best estimate of what global average surface temperature was in the 10 years to 2020, 1.09 degrees above pre-industrial. So we're about 1.1 degrees over the globe. And actually, if you just look at the land surface, we're already past 1.5 degrees. We're at about 1.59, and the oceans are warming more slowly, so they are still below 1 degree above pre-industrial. And in terms of what's driving all this, concentrations of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, concentrations now higher than at any time, at least the last 2 million years, probably more like 3 or 4 million years. And the same story really with methane and nitrous oxide. They're both higher concentrations than anything that's been seen for the last 800,000 years at least, which is the length of the longest ice cores that we have. Sea level rise now faster in the last century than anything that's been seen from reconstructions over the last 3,000 years. And there's a lot of ice melting, and the rate of ice sheet loss increased by a factor of 4 between the late 1990s and the most recent decade. So this is one of the big worries, the rapid loss of ice, especially from the West Antarctic ice sheet, and what that will mean for sea level rise over the next 1,000 years or more, depending on how warm the climate gets. Which brings me on to this statement that was made very similar statement made when there was a report came out in 2018, the so-called 1.5 degree report from the IPCC, looking at where we'd have to stop emissions to stop warming at no more than 1.5 degrees. And again, it's restated that we need immediate, rapid, large-scale reductions in greenhouse gas emissions to stop warming at 1.5 degrees. In fact, this report basically is almost saying it's too late to stop at 1.5 degrees. We'll be at that level of warming in the decade between 2030 and 2040, unless there's a miraculous decrease in emissions right now. Just how much warmer it gets than 1.5 may only be 1/10 of a degree or so, hopefully not more than a couple of degrees above pre-industrial by the end of the century, because if we get beyond that, we start to run into big problems with extreme events and sea level rise and so on. So one of the big questions is, well, how much more emissions can we put into the atmosphere and still stay below whatever temperature threshold we're talking about? And that's the impetus of the Climate Change Commission's advice. And the Zero Carbon Act, which dictates what the Commission, defines the Commission itself and dictates what it does, is built around this idea of 1.5 degrees of warming and what we would need to stop at to meet that warming level, based on that report that came out in 2018, the so-called 1.5 degree report. Another stronger statement that came out in the most recent report, just to reiterate that climate change is affecting the whole globe, not just temperatures, rainfalls, all sorts of other surface climate conditions, phenology, so the growth of plants, circulation of the ocean, you name it. Everywhere you look, you see the effects of climate change. And the warmer it gets, the bigger the effects. I mean, that's fairly self-evident, I think. So one of the features of the new report is a much more focus on extreme events. So there's a whole chapter on climate extremes, and this is an illustration of one finding. This is based on observations of the past, so what's already happening. And this is a map of the world. Hopefully you can make out the continents and see where New Zealand is down in the bottom right corner there. And this is just the way the globe's divided up for the purposes of the analysis. Everywhere there's red, we already have observed statistically significant increase in hot extremes. Where the shading, the hatching occurs, there's low agreement, and here and there, such as the very southern part of Africa, there's just not enough information to really say. But basically over the whole globe, southern part of South America, and the central part of Africa, yeah, just get my head around that. Over the whole globe, we're seeing already significantly warmer conditions, longer heat waves, hotter heat waves, and you don't only have to look in the newspaper these days to see the amazing events that have been happening around the world. So and you'd expect that, what's happening as we put this greenhouse gas in the air is more heat is being radiated by the atmosphere back down to the Earth's surface, so you'd expect things to warm up. And that's kind of simple in a way. Other changes, like changes in wind circulation, changes in clouds, changes in rainfall, are more complicated because there's more steps you've got to go through to work out what's going on there. And things like rainfall are just patchier, noisier than the temperature record. So if you look at, for instance, extremes in heavy rainfall, it's not as obvious everywhere on the globe. There's a good part of the globe that's coloured in green, which means, again, statistically significant increases in heavy precipitation events, certainly over most of Eurasia, some parts of the Americas and some parts of Africa, and also in the northern part of Australia. But in a lot of places there's just not good enough records, or there's conflicting results, such as for New Zealand, and that's because different things are happening in different parts of a complex topography kind of country as New Zealand. But as time goes on, more of the world gets coloured in green and the extremes become larger. Turning to sea level rise, we're now looking at projections of sea level change into the future, and the colours represent the different emission scenarios that have been used, the shared socio-economic pathways, the SSPs. So the lowest one, 1.9, that's roughly consistent with 1.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century, compared to the late 19th century. And SSP 5, 8.5 is the one where we just burn more and more of the coal and other fossil resources we have and warm the climate by best part of 5 degrees before the end of the century. And you can see, compared to 1900, this graphic is the vertical scale there,
we've got a range of something like 0.5 metre to a bit under 1 metre by the end of the century, which again is consistent with what earlier results have shown. But the dashed line there shows a low likelihood, high impact storyline, which is really what could happen if the instabilities that have been identified in the Antarctic with the sort of rapid loss of ice off the face of ice shelves and the rapid flowing of the water and water getting underneath the ice shelf and then the ice sheet and floating the ice and allowing it to fall into the sea a lot faster. So we can't rule out getting best part of 2 metres of sea level rise this century, but it's considered to be unlikely. The trouble is you've only got to wait a while. I don't know if you can make out the numbers on here, but the plot on the right is where things could be another couple of 100 years down the track in 2300. And the shaded regions, the bluey one is for the low scenario where we take action immediately, and the red shading is for the high scenario where we do the opposite. So even for the lowest scenario, even where we stop warming at about 1.5 degrees, you can't actually rule out 3 metres of sea level rise over the next few 100 years. And of course, if we keep warming things up dramatically, then the sky's the limit almost. And I don't know if you can read the text at the top, but it's saying that we can't rule out even 15 metres of sea level rise in the next couple of 100 years beyond the end of this century, if we allow the warming to get to 4 or 5 degrees above pre-industrial or more than that. So we're locking in big changes in really the map of the world over, essentially forever in terms of our sort of thinking in our lifetimes. And just to hammer that point a little more, another summary graphic. So we've got the warming at the end of the century on the top of these boxes, and then what's the commitment to sea level rise over 2,000 and 10,000 years. Even at 1.5 degrees of warming, we're talking about several metres of global sea level rise over a very long time scale. And if we really push things hard, then that's not quite that possible 33 metres. That's still only about half of the ice that's in Antarctica, so we could see another 30 odd metres on top of that, depending on how much warming we get. So essentially all future generations, for as long as we care to think into the future, are going to have a different map of the world, and a lot of the land masses and islands that we know about now will be either under the waves or significantly threatened by coastal inundation and all the problems that go with having lots of people living near the coast and the coast moving. So another statement from the Summary for Policymakers that essentially the once per century extreme in coastal inundation or coastal erosion type events would be happening at least annually, so at least 100 times more often, at more than half of all the tide gauge locations by 2100, and that's essentially regardless of which trajectory we're on. Obviously, the faster things warm up, that number, at least annually, it becomes monthly and virtually daily if you allow enough warming. So we're really locking in huge changes over significantly long times. Just a quick focus on this part of the world before I move on to the Climate Change Commission part of the story. So this is just a little map summarising for different levels of warming, and this is the focus of the new report, not so much this scenario or that scenario, just when it gets to be a certain amount warmer than pre-industrial, what does the map look like? So we've got maximum temperature on the left, the minimum, total precipitation, the third column, and then the maximum one-day precipitation, the fourth column. And what we see is it's getting warmer over the whole globe, basically. Australia warms faster than the global average because land masses are warming faster than the ocean. Aotearoa is warming at roughly the global rate. Precipitation, it's a little bit hard to see. If you look at the 4 degree warming, the pattern is much the same regardless of the warming level, but you can make it out easier at the 4 degree one. You can see it's essentially sort of wetter in the south and drier in the north, roughly speaking. It's more like it's wetter in the west of the south and drier in the northeast, which that pattern is, again, it's similar to what we've seen from earlier results. But the extreme rainfall is interesting. You see an increase, the percentage change at the bottom there, over large parts of the world, regardless, even if the average precipitation's decreasing. When you have a rainfall event, there's more moisture in the air, so you're going to get heavier rain, and that has big implications for managing stormwater and so on for local authorities in this country and for all communities around the world. Just to zoom in, just some text. So like I was saying, that when you look at the precipitation changes, we're really talking about increases in the west and south, mostly in winter and spring, and decreases in the east and north, but more summer rainfall in the east of both islands, etc. So this is, as was seen with the last IPCC report. The models have been saying this for quite some time now. And of course, as it warms up, ice melts, so the glaciers in this country have decreased in their mass quite a lot in the last 40 years. And with a couple of degrees of warming, most of the glaciers would be essentially gone. There'd be a little stub left up near the top of the main divide, but that's about all. So that's the expected change, and on to what this country is doing about it. So to stop the sort of changes that I was showing, we have to get to zero emissions of carbon dioxide, especially because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for so long. It's the most important one to reduce to zero. So the Climate Change Commission was set up under the Act, which talks about what we have to do to get to zero net emissions of carbon dioxide by 2050, and a matching, and a reduction in methane and other greenhouse gases. And I guess the top line from the advice that came out at the end of May is that it can be done. So there are pathways, there are scenarios for how this country could get to zero carbon dioxide by 2050 that are ambitious enough to reach that goal, that are actually achievable and affordable and equitable. So there's a lot of considerations. A just transition is really important. We can't just, crash the economy as we saw last year with the COVID lockdowns. It has to be done in a way, ideally, that it hurts the least. And, we really need to change the way we operate as a society in this country and elsewhere over the long term. And again, there's good description of how that might play out here from the advice document. So just to start off, where are we at with emissions in this country? This is in 2019. So an interesting way this is calculated, or that we think about this with the Commission and the Act, that's a so-called split gas target. So there's a zero carbon dioxide, but a smaller reduction in methane. The negotiations that will be happening in Glasgow and happen in Paris and so on are based on an all-gas approach, where you apply a scaling factor to the methane. You scale everything to be like carbon dioxide. It's not particularly valid scientifically, but it's the way it's done. And New Zealand, I think, is the first country that's moved away from this in terms of its legislation and actually started looking at gases separately, which is, I think, a really important thing to do. So on the left, the long-lived gas, which is almost all carbon dioxide. It's energy in industry and buildings, that's the red, and transport. The blue is the bulk of our emissions of carbon dioxide. And then methane, or biogenic methane, almost all from agriculture, and most of that's from ruminant animals, that's cows and sheep. So we're at, that's on the next slide, sorry, I thought the numbers were on there. So that's the breakdown. So the advice focused on transport and energy, industry and buildings, because that's where most of the emissions of carbon dioxide are coming from. And agriculture, of course, for the methane emissions. So this slide from the advice, this has turned things into CO2e, carbon dioxide equivalent. So this is the joining everything up for the purposes of international reporting, which was all done in carbon dioxide equivalent. So in 2019 we're at 78 million tonnes, and those are the numbers over the 5 year, or the first one's 4 years. The emissions budgets are divided up into 5 year blocks, and the Commission's put out the first 3. And the first one is actually only for 4 years because we're already well through 2021. So the numbers there are the CO2 equivalent emissions per year on average through those 4 or 5 year periods out to 2035. And the advice will be updated as we go, so we'll extend a bit further and we'll revise the advice in the shorter term next time around. But just to look at that in terms of the actual gases. So for long-lived gases, which is almost all carbon dioxide, this is how it looks. So left of the dashed line there is observations. So the blue line is the net emissions, and the green line is the gross emissions. And the difference is the so-called offsetting, really, mostly from forestry. And the plan with the advice is to push into more native forest rather than exotic, sort of faster growing trees. You get a longer offsetting effect from native forests and all sorts of biodiversity benefits. So anyway, so you can see it's quite a slow start, and then from roughly towards the end of the first budget period, that blue dashed line starts to go down quite steeply, and by the end of the third budget period, you know, the gross values are around 40 megatons as of now. It's well below half of that by the end of the 2030 to 2035. And you can see that the target there, 0 net emissions by 2050. So if things work out well, then we're well on track to reach 0 net emissions of carbon dioxide actually before 2050. For methane, the legislation stipulates a 10% reduction by 2030 and reductions by 2050 in the range from 24 to 47%, which is taken directly from the IPCC numbers. So you can see a fairly steady decrease over the first 3 budget periods, with that line ending up in the range, and exactly where it's going to end up we shall see, but certainly within that 24 to 47% range by 2050. If we look out to 2050 with the long-lived gases, this is where we end up. So on this plot here, the black line is the reference, the current policy, if we do nothing beyond what's already on the books, and that does produce quite a decrease in carbon dioxide emissions, even so. And then you've got the orange and the blue lines from the advice, and this is with two scenarios for how technology develops and how behaviour change evolves. So do more people take up low carbon options, or do they stick with driving their petrol powered cars and so on? And does the efficiency of renewable energy plants such as solar panels increase dramatically and so on? So yeah, there's pluses and minuses with that, and we could do better than the average, or we could face barriers. So anyway, on the time series there, you see the so-called tailwind scenario where everything works out nicely. We get to 0 carbon dioxide by about 2040, and even with the headwind scenario, we still reach 0 net carbon dioxide before 2050. And this is consistent with a warming of 1.5 degrees according to the IPCC numbers. So the time frame under the IPCC report to get to 0 is somewhere between 2045 and 2055. So if things go well, we've beaten that. And even if things don't go well, we're still within the range that's suggested. One of the other things that the Commission was asked to comment on was the nationally determined contribution, which is the thing that's tabled under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change negotiations, the Paris Agreement, the Glasgow meeting coming up soon, and so on. And that's calculated somewhat differently, and it involves international offshore emissions reductions as well as domestic, whereas the advice from the Commission is purely about domestic reductions in emissions and offsetting. At the moment, the nationally determined contribution is a 30% reduction on the 2005 emissions level. It's all a bit confusing because of the different starting dates, starting years used for these calculations. But anyway, the current NDC, 30% below 2005 levels, and to be consistent with the 1.5 degree range from the IPCC, we need to be somewhere between 27% and 45%. That's the interquartile range of these numbers, with a midpoint of 36% below 2005. And the Paris Agreement talks about developed countries leading the way, doing more work than developing countries. So it's not for the Commission to really say what the answer should be. It's a political decision. But the Commission suggests that we should be at least at the midpoint and probably quite a bit above 36%. So it was deemed essentially that the current NDC is not adequate to meet the goal of stopping at 1.5 degrees. So the statements in the advice. So if Aotearoa is to play its part as a developed nation, then we need to see much more than 36% reduction on 2005, and we're currently sitting at 30. And the Minister will take a new number to Glasgow. We don't know what that's going to be yet. And for methane, thinking in the longer term, again, looking at the IPCC report, significant reductions in methane by 2100, but even by 2100, we're still talking about, at most, about a 60% reduction below our current baseline year 2017. And that's because methane stays in the atmosphere for a much shorter time, only 12 or 13 years or so. So as soon as you start turning down the tap of emissions, the amounts in the atmosphere start to decrease. So yeah, that's why you can be a little bit more lenient with methane. Right, I have a feeling I've gone way over time here. So just to summarise. So going back to the IPCC stuff, the climate's changing rapidly, more rapidly than it has for a very long time. We know it's all down to what we're doing, which, that should be, in a way, good news. It might sound like bad news, but we're the ones causing the problem. We know what to do. We know how to reduce our emissions. If we do that, we can actually stop it at some point. If we're going to stop at about 1.5 degrees, we need action. We needed action a few years ago. 30 years ago would have been good, but now it's still not too late. Change is affecting every part of the globe, and extreme events are becoming much more common and more serious around the world. Sea level rise is probably the longest term commitment that we have. We're talking about several metres of sea level rise over thousands of years, almost regardless now. There's enough ice melting that we can't stop some of that, but we really want to avoid rapid sea level rise where we get over a metre this century. That would be extremely hard to deal with. And the advice from the Climate Change Commission does provide this country a roadmap to get to net zero CO2 emissions by 2050, and actually, if we're lucky, a bit before 2050, and to get us to somewhere in that range of 24 to 47% reduction in methane. And that is consistent with meeting our obligations under the Paris Agreement to stop warming at no more than 1.5 degrees. The current NDC, which is what New Zealand has on the table under the Paris Agreement, really needs to be strengthened considerably to be consistent with all that. But yeah, the bottom line from the advice from the Commission is that we can actually do this, and what I hope to see starting at the beginning of next year is that we start to take the action to actually do it. So, thank you.
You spoke about the reduction in terms of consumer responsibility quite a lot. I can't get my head around what the report says about the split between producer and consumer responsibility. Like, if the government was to target, I know that in New Zealand, within the OECD, we have a high rate of consumer emissions per household. But what does the advice from the Commission say about producer responsibility and what's the likelihood of a reduction in that sector producing results?
Could you just summarise that for people who don't know?
Sure. So your question's about producer versus consumer responsibility or emissions, I suppose. And yeah, well, you're right. I'm not entirely sure how to answer that because a lot of the advice talks about what I would see as the producer emissions. That is, reducing emissions in the energy sector and making legislative changes to encourage reductions in emissions in the transport sector, for instance, by incentivising electric vehicles and pumping up public transport and so on. So that would imply that the consumers, the public, would have easier access to greener choices, whether that's renewable electricity or better public transport or cheaper electric vehicles. So I would say the advice is not especially weighted towards the consumer or the producer. It takes a broader view than that. But I might be missing the point of what you're saying. I don't know. Do you want to? Yeah? Yeah? Okay.
Thank you for that, James. Can I ask about nitrous oxide? If I read the inventory right, the increase, or the rate of increase since 1990 for nitrous oxide has been just as steep as it has been for CO2, and much more than it has been for methane. And like CO2, it's a long-lived gas, so should the policy be focusing, in the case of the ag sector, at least as much on nitrogen and that cycle as on
Right. So the question is nitrous oxide, and what we're doing about that, or what's the advice about that? And nitrous oxide is a long-lived gas. So I think I was saying, here's the graphic for the long-lived gases, mostly, almost all carbon dioxide. Well, nitrous oxide is in there as well. So ways to reduce emissions of nitrous oxide, a lot of that comes down to fertiliser use in the agricultural sector and waste from ruminant animals. And again, the goal is to get to zero net emissions of the long-lived gases, which is carbon dioxide plus nitrous oxide. And the offsetting through forestry captures carbon dioxide, not nitrous oxide. I'm not exactly sure what the reduction in nitrous oxide is by 2050. It's a much smaller amount of emissions than the CO2, so you could say it's relatively less important.
Couldn't you also say it's a more intractable problem given the pace at which it's increased? And would say taxing the hell out of urea?
Yes, yeah, and we need to see decreases in all the greenhouse gases. I guess it's because it's a much smaller component of the story. The concentration in the atmosphere is much less, and the amount that is being emitted by this country at least is relatively small. I'm not trying to excuse that, but it's less of an urgent problem, I would say, just because of the volumes of the gas we're talking about.
Yes, because you keep use the term "if things go well" for those emission reduction targets, and I'm just wondering, internationally, like we got a lockdown and so many people, so few international travel in the last 1 or 2 years, did that even make a dent? And another thing is that internationally, what would be the most sort of scary possibility? People think that will happen, then it will ruin the whole thing. We seem to have a 1 day warfare in Afghanistan, and so military-wise, I think that part maybe will make some difference, although that number was never estimated for military action. was it? But also like we know the Brazil, the deforestation, the rainforest, also affected. What will be the international community to say this will be the shocking and really scary happening to reach the whole target?
Good traction questions there, pretty large scale.
Yeah, so you're asking about, I think, the sort of worst case scenarios with the changing climate.
Yeah, just what people fear, most likely, if that happens, doing it, our reduction plan and goal.
Yeah, boy. Well, I think, you know, if emissions reductions do not really kick in this decade, and we push through 2 degrees of warming by the middle of the century, it could be very ugly indeed. You know, you mentioned warfare, military emissions, and there are estimates of that. But the pressures that go on populations around food production with crop failures through extreme events, sea level rise displacing people, water availability becoming a problem in some parts of the world, there's going to be a lot of pressure on resources, and a lot of populations are going to, you know, people are going to start fighting over things like water. You know, it could be really, really bad, and this is what amazes me. I've been working on this stuff for 25 years, and we still don't have any action, really. And I'm staggered at that, given the magnitude of the risks that we face. I'm amazed that there has been very little real policy action, like Greta Thunberg said the other day. You know, it's a blah blah blah, green recovery kind of thing, and that's the truth. So if the world's policymakers don't really get their act together now, you know, starting in Glasgow, things could go really badly. In terms of the advice, the sort of headwinds and tailwinds, that's a much smaller view of things. It's just what happens in this country and our access to green technology and how on board the population becomes with the kind of action we need to take. So, you know, you can look at changes in consumer behaviour that would encourage faster uptake of zero emissions vehicles and so on. So you can get to the goal you need to get to faster, but it takes no account of that sort of international scenarios or the settings. So it's much more focused just on the reductions in emissions in this country.
How about international travel
Yeah.
reduction?
Can you hold that? As John, if you could hold your question. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. We're just running against time a little bit. Thanks, James. Thanks very much. I'd like to introduce Catherine Leining. She's a policy fellow at Motu Economics and Public Policy Research. She leads their program on shaping New Zealand's low-emission future. And in government roles, she helped design our emissions trading scheme. She'll tell you a little bit about that. And she was a delegation member to the UNFCCC negotiations. In 2019, like James, she was appointed to the Climate Commission. So, Catherine.
Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Catherine Leining tōku ingoa. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for making the time. Does this work? Yep. Yeah, okay, great. So I work for Motu Economic and Public Policy Research, which is an independent non-profit research institute. We don't take an organizational position on issues. We operate as a research collaborative. So the views I'm expressing don't represent Motu. They're just my personal views as a researcher. And then I'll be talking about some of the Commission's advice on policy. And, you know, coming out of James's presentation, I always feel so overwhelmed with the challenge that we're facing. And I always want to carry a message that there actually is a lot that we can do and that everything we do helps. You know, it's not a binary, either this or that. Like every fraction of a degree that we save is progress. And so in the presentation today, wearing my Motu hat, I'm going to look at why we need emissions pricing and a quick trip through the ETS past, present, and future. And then with my commission hat, I'll look at the policy approach in our advice at a high level and just summarize some next steps for decision making and the outlook for COP26. So in terms of why we need emissions pricing, the key issue here is external costs and benefits. So there are people out there who profit from emitting activities, but they don't experience the environmental costs that accrue globally and over generations. And then the people who pay to reduce emissions don't get the public benefits that accrue globally and over generations. And so this ends up incentivizing the wrong behavior. And right now our price signals are actually pushing us in the wrong direction. We act like fossil fuels are cheap when they're actually taking away the stability of our climate system. They are not cheap. So we need to try to remedy this price signal problem. And emissions pricing can help with that. And it can take the form of emissions trading or a tax. The concept here is to make emitters face some of the external costs of their emissions. This creates incentives to choose low emission alternatives and to help low emission innovators to be more competitive. And an ETS offers flexibility in where and how emission reductions actually occur. When you auction units, it can generate government revenue that can be returned to the economy strategically. And then one of the bonuses that if you set an ETS up properly, it can cap emissions. It hasn't done this in the past, but we have one now. But there's a lot that emissions pricing cannot do by itself. And if you've been reading the newspaper for the last few months, you'll have heard a lot of debate about, can we just do it all with the ETS or do we need more? Does the ETS need mates? Is kind of how the debate is evolving. And there are some really important things an ETS cannot do. First of all, it cannot overcome non-price barriers to change. There are things that people could be doing right now that would save money and they're not happening. And just raising the emission price isn't going to make them happen either. We also have issues with driving large-scale and long-term coordination and investment at the edge of innovation. And that's where you really need to get government support and coordination for long-term investment. We also have issues about multiple objectives, because an ETS price doesn't necessarily align mitigation with adaptation, and we need to be thinking about both of them at the same time. And we've got sectoral priorities beyond climate change that we need to manage, and an ETS won't take care of that. And then finally, we've got a set of issues around how we take care of each other. First of all, how do we ensure a just transition that safeguards well-being for the people in the system? How do we give better effect to Te Tiriti o Waitangi? And how do we safeguard future generations? And an ETS isn't necessarily going to accomplish those objectives. Those things are so important, so we really need an integrated policy package. And this is my key message from the presentation. We have to think broadly about what it would take to deliver a desirable low-emission and climate-resilient future for New Zealand. There is no silver bullet technology, and there is no silver bullet policy instrument. You know, the ETS is really blunt. It takes care of quantity but not quality. It creates an opportunity but not equity. So we really need a package to help deliver that. So where were we in the past? I'm assuming this is a pretty knowledgeable audience, so I'm not going to spend too much time, and it's a bit grim. We had issues with supply and price management. In particular, we had unlimited access to offshore mitigation, which turned out to be low quality and low price. We had a 1-for-2 unit obligation, like a 50% discount in non-forestry sectors from 2010 to 2018. And we had a fixed price ceiling, a really hard price ceiling at $25 per ton. And you put those three things together and it created a very weak price signal for change. We also had some sectoral issues. We had post-89 afforestation in the system, and we've used carbon stock accounting, which means you earn units as the forests grow and then you have to surrender them as they harvest. The complexity of that system has discouraged a lot of foresters from joining the system. As of 2020, only 48% of the eligible afforestation was in the ETS. The rest of it is out and not subject to the price signal. And then we had this period of re-registration arbitrage by post-89 foresters, which I won't go into, but they figured out how to use the low international price to exit the system and kind of pump more units, and this helped to contribute to the large bank of units, the stockpile. And then we've had pricing of the biogenic emissions from agriculture, so this is methane and the nitrous oxide that was asked about. This has been enabled since the beginning, but it's been deferred indefinitely. And here's what that looked like. Prices went down a cliff. The lowest price in the system for an NZU was $1.45 in February 2013. And I guess whoever bought at that price has probably made some good money. It has rebounded over time as we disconnected from the international market and people started to price based on their expectations for growing ambition over time. But it's kind of been a psychological price. It's driven by long-term policy expectations without clear policy signals. We've basically lost a decade of investment signals for a low-emission future, and it's going to be really hard to get that decade back. In terms of the present, we are seeing some light. There has been progress. There was an Emissions Trading Reform Act in 2020, and there were 5 key changes. The first was adding a cap to our cap and trade system. We finally got our cap. So we now have an auctioning system that allows the government to sell units into the market. And if we were to connect to offshore mitigation, which is not possible now, that would also be bound by a cap, so the quantity would be limited. We've got new price safeguards. So we now have an auction reserve price, which sets a minimum price at which the government would sell units into the market. And then we've got a cost containment reserve trigger price that helps to put extra volume into the market. And that's supposed to happen when prices are too high. Now we've just had some interesting experience with that, which I can go into in the question time if there's time. But we've got a more flexible price structure that allows the market to find a price, but allows the price to rise in line with our targets. And that's really important. Next, we've got a default pathway for phasing out free units to our emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industrial producers. Now, it's a very slow pathway. It's a very blunt pathway, but it is a pathway. We've got incentives for new forests by the introduction of averaging accounting. So instead of having the shark tooth of units going up and down, we have an average over time for plantation forests. And we have a new permanent forest activity that's coming in that replaces the former permanent forest sink initiative. Hopefully this creates better incentives for long-term forestry. And then we are now preparing for pricing agricultural emissions by 2025. And there's further work through a joint government and sector initiative called He Waka Eka Noa. And they will be reporting back on their work on preparing the sector for emissions pricing and looking at an alternative to the ETS for pricing the biogenic emissions from agriculture. So this is a huge step in the right direction for helping our ETS deliver on our Paris target. This is sort of how the cap structure has been laid out so far from 2021 to 2026. It operates on a rolling basis, so it gets extended 1 year every year. So the blue line is our auction pot. So this is the government selling units into the market. And you can see that we would be, if we take a price of $65 a ton, then the auction revenue would be about $6.9 billion over this 6-year period. So that's a fair amount of money that could be returned back to the economy. And then the orange band is your implied industrial free allocation. So that's about $3 billion at $65 a ton. So that's pretty considerable as well. That is foregone auction revenue, and we need to think about the benefits to New Zealand of giving that to industrial producers rather than auctioning it. And then there's the cost containment reserve, which is there to help ease supply if prices get too high. And again, that's only supposed to get triggered under certain circumstances, and it recently got triggered for the wrong kind of circumstances, but these things happen. Anyway, so this is the new cap structure that we can have, and you can see that the government has set it fairly flat at the beginning, and then it's starting to decline. The prices there are not price predictions. Those are just sample prices, just to give people a sense of order of magnitude. So I'm not trying to predict what the ETS price is going to be over that period. And here's what our new price corridor looks like. So the blue line is the auction reserve price, the minimum price at which the government would sell units into the market. And then the orange line is the trigger price at which additional volume comes in. Now, it's important to understand this does not work like the hard price protection we had in the past. It does not guarantee a maximum price. And this price corridor does not control prices in the secondary market. This is only at auction. So there is still the flexibility for prices to fall below this corridor or above this corridor, depending on what happens in the marketplace. So this is where NZU prices have traveled from 2019 to 2021. And you can see we've got a really nice upward trend. And what's really interesting is that we're sustaining this trend in a global pandemic and with the announcement that the aluminium smelter is going to be closing. And this shows us that people are pricing emissions based on their long-term expectations for where the country needs to get to and what supply is going to look like. So they are pricing in long-term expectations for mitigation. And that's good. The price today was 64.50 New Zealand. The price yesterday in the EU ETS was about 64.70 euros. So that's $108 New Zealand. So our price may feel high to us, but compared to the EU ETS, you know, not so much. But future challenges, where do we go next? The 2020 reforms were so important, but I've identified 9 areas of policy concern where we need to be thinking strategically about where to go next. The first is industrial free allocation. We really need to look at how to better align the amount of allocation we're given with the actual risk and cost of leakage. And the government has already identified over-allocation as a problem. Second, market governance. The government has just finished consultation processes on both industrial free allocation and market governance. There's an understanding that our market is transitioning into higher stakes, higher prices. We need to make sure that the system is fit for purpose, that we understand what's going on, there isn't unfair market manipulation and so on. So we really need to strengthen that. And that's critical to maintain investor confidence and integrity. The next is ETS revenue recycling. Again, there's a considerable amount of money that's being generated here. In the May budget announcement, the government said that it's going to be earmarking, hypothecating this revenue for what they called emissions reductions activities. And we don't know exactly what that means or how it's going to work, but that has really important just transition implications about what we do with that money. Does it get returned to every household for emissions reductions, or does it get put into specific projects? It's going to be interesting to see what happens with that, and that's really important for social license as the emission price gets high. Then we've got some sectoral issues, and a really big one is forestry. One of the key issues we've identified is that the incentives right now are for fast-growing exotics. And in the long term, we really need a lot of native planting that provides long-term sequestration. And so we need to look also at how forestry can keep us on track, but still have a focus on gross emission reductions in energy and industry, in transport and so on. So the role of forestry in the ETS needs to be managed. And right now, the signals are not quite where they need to be. There's the pricing of biogenic agricultural emissions, looking at what an alternative to the ETS might look like and how ambitious that will be and how you prepare the sector. And then there's sectoral policy integration. How do we think about the strategic goals we have for individual sectors and how to integrate those effectively with emissions pricing? And then we've got some big picture things like the connection with international carbon markets. At the big negotiation meeting that's coming up soon, there's going to be a lot of discussion on the carbon market mechanism in the Paris Agreement. How does that have implications? The EU ETS is now talking about a carbon border adjustment mechanism that could affect New Zealanders who are exporting into the EU. So there's some really interesting international carbon market developments that we need to monitor. And we could think about in the longer term, does the ETS want to link, or will linking happen government to government rather than through ETS participants like it did in the past? There's a big question mark about voluntary carbon markets. You know, we all know the experience of going on an airplane and being invited, oh, you want to tick a box and you can offset your emissions? Our system for doing offsets that aren't double counted by the government is disappearing with the Paris Agreement, and we don't have a replacement for that. And so at the time when there's all this interest in doing extra stuff to help, we're kind of losing the architecture to do that, and we need to clarify how that would work. And the biggest one is policy predictability. This one aces everything else. We have to manage to get enough policy predictability across election cycles to grow, because we cannot continue to have crash and burn cycles with every new election. We've got to be able to build progressively over time. And while it's really important to have that political flexibility to respond to changing times, we've got to have a core that stays consistent so people know how to invest and have confidence to make big changes. So on that note, I'm going to turn over to the Commission's advice on how it's approaching policy. So James was presenting on our emissions budget process. In addition to that, we provide direction advice on the direction of policy. So we don't actually advocate for a specific policy mix, but we provide advice on the direction of policy to help inform an emissions reduction plan that the government then decides on. And the policy approach that the Commission has picked has 3 key pillars. The central one is pricing, but there's also a pillar around addressing those other non-price barriers to change, and a pillar for looking at that innovation frontier. And then surrounding that, we've got critical things like the partnership between the Crown and iwi and Māori under Te Tiriti. We've got managing the just transition, and then we've got effective governance. We really need to have this integrated package of measures that takes pricing into account but isn't solely dependent on pricing. So there's a number of important cross-cutting actions, and in the interest of time, I won't linger on these. I know this is a knowledgeable audience, and they're detailed in our report, but some of the particularly important ones for cross-cutting are, first of all, looking at that Crown-Maori relationship and how we can enable a Maori-led approach to an equitable transition for Maori, and building better partnership models. There's encouraging cross-party support, alignment and coordination within government, and that's central and local government, better public involvement in consultation and public participation, and then developing an equitable transition strategy to make sure that we carry people with us and people's well-being needs are met. In addition, there's a suite of advice about improving the ETS, and it touches on all of the things that I've just been detailing. Looking at putting the focus on gross emission reductions and better managing forestry in the ETS, updating the unit supply and price settings, looking at market governance, and then looking at the voluntary carbon market, and then the ongoing improvements around industrial allocation and so on. So that whole package of measures is supported in our advice. It's interesting to look at the emissions values that were used in some of our modeling scenarios. Now, these are not ETS price projections. That's really important. This is a modeling input. The research that we did suggested that by 2050, we need to have a price of $250 a ton in order to get where we need to go. And then we've backcasted to see where that needs to take us, and then done a kind of joined up from where we were starting in 2020. So this is sort of an approximate price pathway that was taken into account in our advice. And the Commission's recommendations on where the price, the cost containment reserve trigger price should be is wide enough to accommodate this, but we know that policies could also lower the price in the ETS relative to what's needed. And then there's a number of critical sectoral actions in addition to the price. And these are detailed around transport, stationary energy, waste, agriculture, looking at specific things that we feel need to happen as strategic objectives, sector by sector, in order to keep us on track for a transition that really works for Aotearoa New Zealand. In terms of next steps, there are roles for both government and the Commission. Again, the Commission is only an advisory function, and all decisions rest with the government. So the government has to decide on changes to the NDC, and it will be doing this hopefully by COP26, which is starting at the end of the month. The government also has to make decisions on our emissions budgets through 2035 and the first emissions reduction plan, so that's the policy mix through 2025. And originally that was supposed to have been done by December, and you'll have seen the press that the government is now amending the legislation to give an extension through May, and this is because of COVID and the challenges of consulting. So we are expecting that consultation process to happen soon. I really encourage you to engage in that. It's going to be really important to look at how those policies are formulated. The government has to deliver its first national adaptation plan by August 2022, and then it has to propose the alternative pricing mechanism to agriculture by December 2022. So we've got a really, really important year coming up for putting in the policies that hopefully will put us on track for 2030. Within the Climate Change Commission, having finished this huge milestone of getting our first advice report out, we now are picking up roles around providing advice on the next round of unit supply settings for the ETS and the price controls. And that's a bit challenging because it also relates to the government's decisions on the emissions budgets, which are now going to be delayed. We need to advise on the progress made by the primary sector toward getting ready for trading or pricing, alternatively under He Waka Eke Noa. And then we're supposed to provide advice on what level of assistance should be provided, like free allocation or other forms of assistance to agriculture under the alternative pricing mechanism. So we've got a very challenging work program for 2022. And I'll just touch really briefly on the outlook for COP26. So this marks, well, every 5 years there's supposed to be a review of ambition and a ratcheting up of ambition. And so one of the key priorities here is to boost the ambition of NDCs, because we're currently on track for 3 degrees C. In fact, earlier today I was just reading a synthesis report from the UNFCCC Secretariat on current NDCs as of July. And it said that by 2030, we will have used up 89% of the global budget for 1.5 degrees C. And that basically we would have 1 year left based on the average annual emissions over that decade for the 2030, so I mean, it's, the talk about running out of time. And then we need to complete the Paris rulebook, especially around transparency, so how countries report their progress against their NDC, and around carbon markets, which is a critical issue for New Zealand because we do not expect New Zealand to be able to meet all of its NDC through domestic-only action. And then there's a huge push to increase climate finance. Countries had committed to mobilize $100 billion US per year, and they're falling short. And that's a real act of faith to developing countries that we're making a difference. Oh, I did. Sorry, that should be 100 billion. Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. Yes, that's definitely 100 billion per year. And no developing country would let me live that one down. Thank you for making the correction. So that's kind of a highlight of what lies ahead for the Commission. But yeah, I think there's a lot of challenging decisions that need to be made in the next year to help chart that course toward 2030, and just really encourage people to engage in the consultation process that will be coming up. So happy to take a couple of questions. Thanks. Yeah.
Slide for the future of the ES biogenic agricultural emissions. I presume that's methane emissions.
It's methane and nitrous oxide.
Yeah.
And there's a possibility nitrous oxide could be handled within the ETS, but methane could be handled either in the ETS or in a separate mechanism.
So if it was in the ETS, would you convert them to CO2 equivalent? Or how would you trade off methane emissions against everything else in ETS?
Yeah, so in the emissions trading scheme right now, in the default legislation, the gases would be treated on a CO2 equivalent basis using the global warming potentials that are used across the Act. So that's what would happen if the default pathway is used. And under that default pathway, that would cover both methane and nitrous oxide under the ETS. I need to be clear, actually, there is a possibility the alternative pricing mechanism could cover nitrous oxide from fertilizers as well. I think that may still be up in the air. For a new pricing instrument, it's a blank page, and that would be an interesting decision for the government to look at how you set the price in that alternative system relative to the price in the ETS and the extent to which you use metrics to get there and to provide equivalence. They may just choose to do a different price. So, we'll just have to wait and see. So it's a really interesting issue. We'll have to see what comes out in the design proposal. Jonathan? Yeah.
So, Catherine and James, thanks for excellent presentations, and thanks for all the hard work you've put in recent years with the Commission. A question about the NDC. So the Commission has said that the current NDC is not compatible with the Paris Agreement, and it said that there are good reasons, therefore, for increasing the NDC, even if we were just to do the average amount. But it's also said on equity grounds, New Zealand should be doing more than the average, so that the NDC should be even more demanding. The Commission's also said that there's really no way we can meet even the current NDC solely with domestic emission reductions and sequestration, so that we will have to purchase offshore credits. And I guess I have two questions, Catherine. The first is, given the current EU ETS price that you've just quoted, 108 New Zealand dollars a tonne, realistically, if we were to buy through the European ETS, if that was possible, or anything equivalent, your Commission is recommending that the New Zealand government spend many, many billions of dollars buying offshore credits. I mean, it could be $5 to $10 billion, depending on the price, maybe even more. And I suppose the first question is, how realistic is that politically? And isn't there a risk that this could actually undermine political consensus on climate change and create merry havoc politically? The second question, I guess, is related, but why do you think we couldn't reduce our domestic emissions more rapidly than you're suggesting?
Thank you. So I'll repeat the question for people who are listening online. The question is about the level of reliance on offshore purchasing to help meet our NDC and the cost implications of that, and then why can't we do more domestically than we are to try to bridge the gap. I'll take a first shot at this, and then James, if I overlook something, please feel welcome to dive in. when the New Zealand government set its NDC back in 2015, it always assumed that it would be through a combination of domestic emission reductions, domestic forestry, and offshore mitigation. I think there was always recognition that New Zealand wanted to do more to help, as both a progressive partner and as from equity considerations to do, and that it was capable of doing more to help through taking global responsibility than only acting at home. So I think we've always expected there to be a margin of purchasing that could be involved. In my mind, where that is most effective is when that money goes toward developing countries who are desperately trying to decarbonize and who offer more cost-effective mitigation than what we can do domestically. And so we actually help to create a more economic outcome for everyone. We accelerate progress in developing countries, and we keep our domestic reduction pathway on a pathway that avoids severe economic disruption, which our research suggests what would happen if we tried to meet it through domestic-only action. So the scenario where we have to buy mitigation from the EU ETS, that would not be an ideal scenario. Ideally, we'd be looking for other partners, and this is an area I'll take off my commission hat and put back on my Motu hat. You may be familiar with the work that Susie Kerr has done on climate teams, which is looking at how you could do government-to-government trading. She's been doing some research, particularly focused on Chile and Colombia, about how New Zealand might be able to combine efforts with other developed countries that also want to buy mitigation. They could pool their effort and actually help to generate substantial progress in developing countries, at prices that would be below what you'd expect to see in the EU ETS. Now, it would take time to develop that kind of an agreement, and there's a lot of uncertainty about exactly how much that mitigation would cost, but I think those pathways are promising. And we've already seen Article 6 trading agreements happening between Switzerland and Peru, Ghana, and Thailand. So there is some initial momentum happening in this area for cost-effective trading of mitigation between countries. So I think it can be done. The issue is how quickly can it be done to ensure integrity, and when will we know what volume will be available and how much it's going to cost. So this is not a low-cost exercise. I mean, the issue, the concept of that we can buy cheap mitigation offshore is gone forever. This will not be cheap. It's going to be way up the cost curve for the developing countries, but to the extent the developing countries' cost curve is better than ours, it still makes sense to do that, and it helps them to leapfrog the development pathway that we followed. So I think it can be done and can be done well. We may not rule out the possibility that New Zealand could buy from more advanced ETS markets. Whatever New Zealand buys has to come with a corresponding adjustment under the NDCs of the host country. That means it basically has to add that mitigation back in. So again, the EU, if we wanted to, there's no mechanism right now that would allow New Zealanders to go over and start buying European Union units and bring them over here toward our Paris target, because the governments would have to sign up to a corresponding adjustment. And yeah, so I'm hoping the scenario that you're outlining is it's a possibility, but it should be down the list of options. In terms of why we can't do more domestically, this is laid out in our advice report. We are guided by a large number of considerations in the Climate Change Response Act about how to ensure that this is a manageable, just transition for the economy. And we've lost a decade of progress, and it's a slow shoulder. So our pathway recognizes to avoid really serious disruption that we need to kind of bring it down, and then use the line that James produced showed that steeper decline in the future. So it's just about turning it, and then it speeds up over time. So our assessment is we just cannot do it that fast and make a globally equitable contribution.
Could I just have one
Yeah.
commentary? And
Yeah.
that's to say, on current projections, Norway will have over a third of its light vehicle fleet electric by 2023, and on your projections we won't reach that until 2035. 2035, 12 years after Norway. So I think the scope for faster action.
Yeah. Well, our emissions budgets represent multiple pathways for getting there, and we've tried to factor in uncertainties that the EV supply may be constrained, or the EVs may be cheaper and more available than we're expecting, and we're trying to weigh that up against the kinds of behavior change. How quickly do people actually adopt them? So there's lots of uncertainties that we weigh up in going into emissions budgets, and then we provide advice on the direction of policy. Our policy is pretty clear. We need to electrify as much of transport and process heat as we possibly can. At the same time, we're decarbonizing our electricity, and that formula needs to happen. If we can get there fast, faster, great. You know, we're not saying do it more slowly than we have to, but our best assessment right now is that there could be constraints in the supply. Now, you know, when I look at this, New Zealand's population is like half the size of Greater London. So, you know, our marginal EV demand compared to global demand, you know, we could do it if we could get ourselves in line. So there might be ways to do it. But, you know, we've seen the huge disruption from COVID, and we can't have that kind of disruption and maintain social license for a climate transition. You know, in COVID, transport emissions dropped 40%. That's what we're looking for, but we didn't do it the right way. Yeah. Rafe?
Thanks very much for your remarks, and James. Very lucid. I really had a question which followed on from Jonathan's in a way. And it's about the social license to operate. And you've seen it playing out in a very interesting way with COVID. There's a lot of license to begin with, and it fades over time as the yards get harder. In this area, it's a longer game, and it might be very hard to sustain over that 15, 20-year period. And so I guess the question is, how do we sweeten that process with very strategic government involvement and pointing to things like public transport subsidies, using some of the ETS auction proceeds, for example, for investing in those. Creative ways, I guess, to just make that social license more sustainable, more durable. Have you given that much thought? Because I'm just not sure we're going to be able to sustain it and on the current mix of policies. With resentments emerging around who gets the access to EVs and all sorts of things.
Yeah. This issue of managing the distributional impacts and maintaining social license is so important. And I think this sits at the heart of the Commission's recommendation for an equitable transition strategy that involves localized transition planning. I mean, I think we've seen really clearly there's a huge difference between setting a target and owning a target. And if we had localized transition planning where individual communities were talking about what this transition means for them, and we actually had buy-in and cooperation and people understood their needs better, I think maybe we would start to move in that direction, that people might own it more. But I think you're raising a really important consideration. But at the same time, the climate impacts are going to be slamming us and reinforcing why we need to be doing this. So I don't want fear to be the main motivator. I think that needs to be a combination of opportunity and fear. And I think that there are opportunities here to actually improve how we do things. There's so much injustice now that I think we could help to improve if we take a fresh look at how we do energy and transport and waste and some of those things. I think there are opportunities there. But yeah, exactly. Yeah. But to me, it's about starting to build a whole series of social conversations at multiple levels about what the challenges are and how to resolve them. And that's all I can see. I think my biggest concern is that it becomes a political football and someone comes and says, oh, look, we won't have to do anything, and offers that as an option. And I just don't think that can be an option. And to me, what binds future governments is enduring public support. And so if the public and business get together and say, we demand this for the future of our children, we demand this for the future of our international competitiveness because it's going to affect our trade relations and just personal relations, then maybe that's what provides that continuity. Yeah, but I really reinforce the importance of your question. I wish I had a better answer.
One last question.
I just had a technical question and then one about the role of the Climate Commission. You talked about the secondary market in terms of the ETS. Are there current legislative controls on the secondary market within the scheme? Like once it's out there, not the government releasing it, can people do what they want with them?
There are restrictions on who can be signed up in the New Zealand Emissions Trading Register and participate. But beyond that, once they receive units, it's like an asset that they hold, and they can exchange them however they like. They can't be sold offshore. They have to stay onshore, but in terms of how long they hold them before they surrender and the prices and so on, it just operates like a trading market. Those transactions are managed in terms of New Zealand's standard market transaction things in terms of avoiding fraud and those types of things. But I think there's some concern that there might be gaps in the oversight of the ETS, and that's where the market governance consultation comes in. The government doesn't exercise price control over the secondary market. There's no price control, and once the units are out there, once they're bought at auction or handed out through to forestry or to industrial free allocation, they're just out there for circulation.
Thank you. My question about the role of the Commission was you talked about policy predictability as key, so that's about investor confidence. Do you think that the Commission's role, like obviously that's what we're trying to do with setting up of the Commission, having stewardship over a longer time, but do you think that to be effective in delivering action, some elements of parliamentary democracy should be compromised, as in a bigger role for the Commission?
I'd be delighted to comment on that, actually, but I'll offer a personal view. I think the hope behind creating the Climate Change Commission is creating a source of independent expert advice that creates a solid, consistent foundation which politicians of all colors can make good decisions. And I think that concept is enormously useful. And we see what's happened in the UK and this is the model that we're following. Just about the only policy area they can agree on across parties is climate change, and they've done that through having a really successful, UK Climate Change Committee, which has enough weight and enough reputation and enough expertise to really be able to provide serious advice. And so we followed a similar model here, that if we can provide really outstanding advice, then it creates a common evidence base for people to make really good decisions. To me, the power of the Climate Change Commission comes from its independence and the fact it serves as an advisor. Because if we became an undemocratic decision maker, we would not last very long. As soon as someone made a decision, as soon as we made a recommendation that people weren't happy with and they had no means to get to our decision, we would be disbanded. I mean, it just wouldn't stand in a democracy. And we've seen this when people come out with controversial proposals. It really needs to be subject to democratic contestability. And as challenging as that can be sometimes, I think the value is there in the long term. So I actually see that as a strength of our strength, is that we are an independent advisory body. And we can just provide the best advice that we can and hope that people take it.
Just to endorse what Catherine just said. And I think, the way the legislation's set up, there is a strong incentive that the government has to respond appropriately. So, yeah, I totally agree that keeping things as they are is ultimately the way to go. You'd get into trouble very quickly if we weren't set up as an independent advisory body, I think. Yeah.
I'd just like to thank these two very, very much. I'd like to arrange for you two to present to Cabinet on Monday, perhaps, because it was a very rich, very powerful presentation. So could you join me in thanking our two speakers?